Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak here. It's quite a privilege and an honor to be on stage in front of such a distinguished group of individuals, of delegates. So as mentioned, I'll do this without slides to make this as interactive as possible, and hopefully not to slip into too much of my assistant professor mode. But what I'd like to do is, as assistant professor in ethics and technology, my focus is really on robot ethics. So I explore the relationship between robotics and ethics, and then vice versa between ethics and robotics. And in addition, as was mentioned, I'm co-director of the Foundation for Responsible Robotics. What I do there is trying to bring the academic world outside of the walls of the institution or the university. So really bringing all of this academic research to industry, to NGOs, to try and shape a future of responsible robotics. And of course, the first question that we have to ask is, what does this future look like, right? And so that's why this is an important forum for having these discussions. My career actually began, I don't have traditional training in philosophy and ethics. My career began as a research assistant at a robotics institute at CSTAR, Canadian Surgical Technologies and Advanced Robotics. And while I was working there, I was a part of a team that were training surgeons how to use the Da Vinci surgical robot and the Zeus telesurgical system, so the system that could do surgery at a distance, long-distance remote robotic surgery. And it was during this time that I started to ask questions about how do the surgeons and the patients actually experience this technology? What is the meaning of bringing this robot into the surgical suite? And so really, I took this idea and I decided to combine ethics, to bring ethics into the design space of robotics and AI, to see if there was a way to do it. And so that links me with the story that I want to tell to you today, which is really an exploration, but also a plea for ethics in the sense that it can be a driver of innovation. And the reason why this is sometimes considered a novel idea is because ethics is often seen as a hindrance. Ethics slows innovation, or it makes us think about these complicated and often annoying questions. But really, we need to change the rhetoric to see ethics as a tool that we can use to push engineers and developers to go a step further. So of course, in order to do this, in order to tell the story of ethics, I have to begin with what is ethics. And I can't really sum up over 2,000 years of ethical debate in under 20 minutes, but we're going to see how this goes. Okay, we'll give it a try. So essentially, ethics is the study of the good life, what it is and how we can achieve it. And then within this conversation, within this discussion, we have different distinctions that we make. We distinguish between good and bad. What is good? How can we define something as good? How can we reason or justify that something is good action? And we also distinguish between right and wrong. And then we have a language that we use to talk about ethical decisions. We use values. Values are these things, these elements that we want to come into being. Values like well-being, whether it's psychological, physiological, dignity, health, protection of the environment. These are all values that are constitutive of what the good life is, or perhaps how we can achieve it. And then where does technology fit into this discussion? Well, there's two schools of thought here. There's some that believe that ethics and technology are somewhat separated, that technology is neutral, and it's really how humans use the technology that determines whether or not it's good or bad, or right or wrong. And then there's another school of thought that differs, that says it's impossible to make these neutral technologies. Technology is essentially value-laden, that the designers, the design teams, they have their own values, their own assumptions, their own norms, their own biases, and these find their way in the resulting product that they're creating. Some canonical examples that explore this or try to explain this really look at the relationship between gender and technology and how we can see norms or assumptions about gender, how they find their way in the resulting technology. One of the most famous examples that talks about this looks at razor blades, talking about how female razor blades are these pink, very simple technologies reflective of what we would imagine a woman would want in a razor, whereas the male razor blade is the black, the blue, very masculine colors, sophisticated, technological, like looking device. So these assumptions about what a certain gender would want in a technology. So technology is creating and co-creating norms, values, meanings. But then looking at technology and the good life, we can we can also see it differently, that technology could change the elements of what we think are constitutive of the good life. So if you consider things like social networking platforms today, this brings us into contact with people around the world. This is something we couldn't have dreamed of 20 years ago, or we only dreamed of 20 years ago, but now has become very much a reality. And for some people, this is part of their good life. They need this connection or this ability to connect in order to feel as though they're experiencing the good life. Alternatively, we can also see how technology has shaped how we get to the good life. So if we consider connections with family, with friends to be part of the meaning and the experience of the good life for us, but we live at a distance. In this day and age, oftentimes we're living far away from our loved ones, from our friends or from our family. But technologies, telecommunication technologies, can help us bridge this geographical gap. So the technology doesn't necessarily change an element of the good life, but it helps us get to the experience of the good life. And of course, robotics and AI will be no different. They will either change what the good life looks like or how we can actually achieve the good life. But that doesn't do much for my overall aim of showing you how ethics can facilitate the design and the development of robotics and AI. So to narrow it down, to be more specific, what we do in robot ethics is we try and cluster the ethical questions into different kind of categories that focus on a particular individual or stakeholder as ethical agent. So the first cluster of ethical issues or questions that we could look at relate to the designer, the developer, the policymaker, the group of stakeholders that are responsible for bringing robotics and AI into the world, for making it a reality. And the questions, the ethical issues that they're looking at are, how do we make these robots so that they preserve dignity, so that they enhance well-being? What capabilities does the robot need to have in order to do this, in order to meet those kinds of criteria? What are the standards that we should have for training data, for using an AI, or training AI? There are also issues related to employment, right? Making a link between the risk of job loss and how we can make robotics that enhance humans rather than replace humans in their job. And we can't forget, too, that the media is also an important stakeholder in this cluster or grouping of questions. That the media oftentimes creates the rhetoric for how we understand robotics and AI to be good or to be bad. So there are ethical choices that are made and that need to be made for this group of stakeholders as well. The next group, or the next cluster of questions, relates to the users of the robotic systems. So different from the people who are actually making or creating regulations around these systems. And this is a really interesting sort of space of questions. This became really prominent around the time that Boston Dynamic was doing their testing of the robot dog. I don't know if any of you remember the YouTube videos that went viral where they were kicking the robotic dog over to see if it could withstand, that kind of pressure, and if it did fall over, how quickly could it get back up. And it was incredible to see how people responded to this. There was a campaign to stop robot abuse, right? That, this idea of we can't treat robots in this way. But really fascinating, the kinds of intuitions and assumptions that this was calling to the fore, getting people to really think about, well, how should we treat these systems? And should we be obliged to treat a system in one way or another? And there's two schools of thought here. Right, there's one school of thought that says it's possible to actually harm or hurt the robot. And we heard in our keynote speech earlier today, there isn't as much credit given to that line of reasoning, at least at this time, right? It's possible in the future we might try and program feelings into the system. But there's another school of thought that looks at the questions related to what these human-robot interactions could do to human-human interactions. If we become used to verbally abusing or physically abusing a robot that looks or resembles a human in some way, shape, or form, what could this do to the way we treat other humans? So these are the kinds of questions that are related to how users should be obliged to act towards robots. And then there's another cluster of questions, and those relates to the robot or the AI as an ethical agent in and of itself. And again, there's two schools of thought here. There's the one school of thought that says, yes, absolutely, robots and AI should be made so that they can make ethical decisions. They can decide between what is good and bad and what is right and wrong, and to have a sophisticated way of doing so. And then the question is how? Who decides what is good, and then we program it? What is the ethical theory that we use to justify the decisions that the system makes? So lots of complicated questions on that sort of train of thought. And then there's another school of thought that says, we shouldn't do that. That if we do that, we land ourselves in a position where we have these systems that can reason in a similar way to humans, and then what does that call upon us to do? Are these systems then deserving of rights and obligations on the part of us humans? So there's still disagreement about how to proceed in terms of whether or not these robots and AIs should be programmed or should be considered ethical agents in and of themselves. So what can we do with this? What can we do with, an understanding of what ethics is, or all of these different questions that robot ethics asks us to address? Well, I would say let's use this as part of the design process. So let's imagine the future, 2030, right? And we use the Sustainable Development Goals as our starting point, but we become more specific. And what does the ideal society or world look like? And we use ethics to get there. So the good life, what does that look like? Well, we can imagine in a humanitarian context, right? The good life is one in which resources go further. More people can be helped. You can get to isolated places that you wouldn't otherwise have access to. And now how can technology fit into this picture? Well, you can have AI-powered drones, which is something that is, many humanitarian NGOs are using already. So you could have the technology fit this picture of the good life. But then, if we look at these questions that robot ethics calls upon us to ask, how do we preserve well-being if we're still going to use the drone? How do we preserve dignity? Well, we need to make sure that we're not causing any physiological or psychological stress to the people under which the drone is flying overhead. So these are things that the designers have to be considerate of, but also the operators, the drone operators, the users. They need to consider the potential for stress as well, but also what does informed consent mean in this instance? And informed consent has a rich ethical tradition to protect individuals from being used as experimental subjects. So how can we protect these ethical values and embed them into the technology? Let's imagine another utopian picture, if you will, of the future. Let's say we have a future where we can minimize stereotyping, discrimination in the sort of bureaucratic world. So in the court system, in healthcare, in banking, perhaps in the policing system, right? Well, if this is our starting point, then we could use AI to detect when a bias has occurred, or to flag, to predict when we could see certain biases in decision-making of court officials or judges. We could imagine another scenario, a third scenario, one in which we pay tribute to the environment, and instead of continuing the degradation and the exploitation of environmental resources, we work to minimize, if not to stop that. And in that situation, we use robotics and AI to power to fulfill those goals. We have robots to test water pollution levels in lakes and rivers. We have drones to fly by factory settings to monitor pollution levels. We have robots cleaning up e-waste in the large garbage cans where we display all of our electronic products or throw out all of our electronic products. So essentially, what I was trying to do is to make ethics the star of these pictures, right? And so what's different about this story, about this picture, is that the good life is the starting point, and the technology is what follows. The technology is what helps us get there, rather than the other way around, rather than starting with, well, what can we do? And moving backwards. Oops, we have some ethical issues that we've run across, now what do we do? But to turn that around. So this utopian picture, this is the one that we're here to discuss over the next couple of days. And this is the picture in which AI is used to test for our biases rather than as a continuation of our biases. Robotics and AI are used to express ethical values rather than degrade or face us with more ethical challenges. So ethics becomes this tool for thinking about how we can actually bring these values, this language to life. So I implore you over the next couple of days to consider the good life as the starting point and to use the language of ethics to paint the picture of the utopian that you believe is important, whether it's humanitarian, environmental, or minimization of stereotypes and discrimination. And the next question then is, what values, what ethical values do we want to be the defining features of AI in the year 2030? Thank you.